Well, it's my great privilege to start us off for the summer. We've done maybe 6 years now, right, Shelley, of faith and literature. About the third year I was here, we started this theme, and it seems to still have some footage, some traction. We may run out of this sooner or later, sooner probably than later, but I'm not going to be here so y'all can figure it out. I'm starting to say that, although I say it now laughing. At September, I'm going to be crying about that whole line. But today, I'm going to kick us off with the theme of homecoming in Scripture and literature, mainly looking at Henri Nouwen, Frederick Buechner, and Craig Barnes. I'll show you the books in a minute. And there's an outline that's out to you. Everybody have an outline? Someone doesn't have one that you'd like to have one? There's sheets going around. Here's a couple hands up back here. Are there extra sheets around? If you're a couple, you might be able to share. If you're together. I made 75. I should have made 100. I'm sorry. So that's nice that we actually ran out. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you that we have a home to come back to, and that is with you, in communion with you as Trinity. And we thank you that we have a home here at St. Michael, and we thank you that we have a home somewhere that we would say is family and community and friends. And we thank you that you have given us the great privilege of coming home and all of what that means in Scripture and in these three books. We thank you for these writers, both in Scripture and these three writers, and we ask you to illuminate our minds and hearts today as we continue to try to faithfully serve you. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. Okay, I came back from Italy and Africa yesterday at 3 o'clock. So if my eyes are drooping, then please excuse me. Actually, I have good energy. No telling what tomorrow will bring. But those of you who get to travel, and it's a great privilege to travel, by the way. We Americans who have the possibility of packing our bags and traveling, we forget sometimes at our peril that there are people with whom we're visiting who've never traveled out of their county. I was with people in Africa, for example, who were my safari drivers, these very, very intelligent, brilliant people about tracking animals. You know, that it's a great art. You know, people used to do that in the United States, Native Americans and cowboys and others who knew how to do this. These people know how to do this in Africa. I mean, they can look at a dirt road and they can see all of the life that's been lived for the last 24 hours on that road just by going over and looking at it carefully. Well, if you ask them about their own life pilgrimage, they'll say, I've never traveled outside of a 2-hour radius of this place in my whole life. And you and I go, wow, really? I mean, I've just traveled halfway around the world to be with you, and you've never traveled out of your own little tiny area of Africa. So it's a great privilege to travel and to be with other traditions and cultures. There's more seats up here, Holland, if you'd like to come up. I know Episcopalians don't like sitting on the front row, but there's no other options. Mark and Terry have to sit on the front pew. There's sheets around. Someone might share with Holland or with Mark and Terry an outline sheet. But so coming back yesterday, the customs agent asked the question, do you have anything to declare, right? And that's a good Christian question, right? Do we have anything to declare? And also, the customs agent also said, welcome home. Welcome home. And that's what today's about, this morning is about, homecoming, welcome home. What does it mean to be welcome home, to have a home to come to or come back to? And what does it mean in Scripture and in literature? I chose 3. I could have chosen a lot of pieces of literature. One of them is The Return of the Prodigal Son by Henri Nouwen, subtitled A Story of Homecoming. A Story of Homecoming. This book, The Return of the Prodigal Son. Who's read this book? A lot of you have seen this book or read it. You've used it in book studies. If you have not, one of the really wonderful books that's been out in the last 25 years. Henri Nouwen sadly died literally on the tarmac of an airport tarmac after he came down the stairs going to do a visiting tour. He died of an aneurysm, I think, and as a fairly young priest, 60s. That's young, isn't it? 60s. Henri Nouwen, known as Roman Catholic theologian, author, taught at Yale and Harvard, and was originally from Europe. Second book, The Longing for Home, Frederick Buechner, The Longing for Home by Frederick Buechner. Also, who's read Buechner in here? Frederick Buechner. Yes, some Buechner readers in here. And then Craig Barnes, who visited here. A lot of us have read Craig Barnes now. His is Searching for Home, Spirituality for Restless Souls. Read any Craig Barnes? Craig Barnes, he came to visit as one of our visiting distinguished lecturers a couple years ago, Shelley, I think now. Anyway, all 3 books I've tried to put into this outline with some scripture. So let's launch in. The first thing that you and I might say about being at home in terms of a theme for our spiritual pilgrimage is to say that we were born in God's image. So we were never, ever, from the very beginning, the day you came out of your mother's womb, the day I did, we had a home. We were born in God's image, and that's our essential home for Christians and for Jews, I might add, and for people of other faiths. Made in God's image is not excluded to Christians, of course. It's told in the Hebrew Scriptures, and that you and I are then also in the image of God. We also find a likeness of parents and family. It's not without saying that you and I were not able to choose any of those things. We were chosen to be in the world at a particular time in a particular place. And while we do really buy into free will and the Episcopal Church, we do think God's providence has something to do with your birth and mine, and how we fit into what I said in the sermon at 10 o'clock, how we fit into a long, long legacy of spiritual pilgrimage. And the paleontologists teach us a lot about how we fit into this incredibly long heritage. And so we're born in God's image and in the likeness of parents and family. And all 3 of our authors talk a little bit about that. Mainly Barnes and Buechner talk a lot about, in these 2 books, about being in the likeness of parents and family. And Frederick Buechner, in his book, Longing for Home, really spins out a great image when he talks about, uses the theme of time and tides. Time and tides. And he likens it to the tide at the beach. People who are beach people, some of you are mountain people. I'm sorry that you're a mountain person. There's a lot of Floridians who are mountain people. They go up to North Carolina, and like Texans go up to Colorado. I asked someone from Colorado on our trip, does Texas own Colorado yet? That person didn't think it was funny. I mean, she sort of frowned. I said, I know there's jokes about Texans in Colorado. She said, oh, there's a lot of jokes about Texans. I said, well, don't tell me right now. Let's leave it kind. But he uses the theme time and tides, which I really like. That is how you and I see homecoming as a tidal. You know, and tidal waves are built by the way our globe, our planet, is fixed in the planets. You know, every tide of every beach is fixed upon how we are set with the moon and in the galaxy. Isn't that amazing? So when you're on any beach, Texas or the Gulf Coast of Florida or wherever you might go, Destin or wherever is your favorite beach. I was in Cape Town, and I was realizing how the tide of Cape Town is attached to the tide of the beach that I like in North Florida. It's all attached to each other. You can't have one tide without the other tides, but every tide does have an individual tide. The tides are built on that particular beach too, so there's a particularity to it. And I like that image that Buechner gives us, that our journey of homecoming is like tides. And we have a tide that brings us in to a home, and we have a tide that takes us out in terms of maturity and growing up, and then we would finally say adulthood. And the people who are in developmental stages will talk a lot about that, including Erickson and a lot of people that Shelley studied in terms of formation. And that's the tide going out. And then very often we're out to sea somewhere, and we would like the tide to carry us back into the beach, right? That's the coming home. And so I like that image that Buechner uses in this book, The Longing for Home. All of the authors talk in such wise about childhood markings. The story in the scriptures about a childhood marking, the only one of Jesus' childhood, is in Luke chapter 2. You remember the story about Jesus going to Jerusalem on the Passover? He goes not only with his family, he goes with the whole community. We think of Nazareth. Jesus, who's from Nazareth, goes with the whole community of Nazareth, and they all would go down in caravan, and they would all go to the Passover. You know, if you were within a day's journey, nowadays a day's journey, it could be a week in ancient times, then you were required to go to Passover in Jerusalem. If you lived outside of the Fertile Crescent and it was not possible for you to get, you were to turn to the east. You were to be in your local synagogue. But if you lived within some range of a journey, then you were expected to come to Jerusalem every year for Passover. So Jesus lived in that day. And so there was an expectation. And so in that story, he went into the temple. He was teaching and learning with the rabbis. He's 12 years old. So something is already remarkable about this guy. But then the very human part of it starts, and that is on the way back to Nazareth, that they discover, Mary and Joseph discover that Jesus is not with them. And it has this little nuance in chapter 2 about how they might be, the word in the Hebrew is, and then later the Greek is called Mary was disturbed. You know how understated that is? I mean, this is a mom who's, where have you been? We've been sick about you. Don't you care about anybody but yourself? You know, this is the kid who comes in at 3 o'clock in the morning, who has the family car and has been drinking beer, right? I mean, this is not mild upset. I mean, this is like scolding mad is Mary and Joseph when they get there to say, where have you been? And we found out halfway back to Nazareth that you're not even with the caravan. And he had been teaching in the synagogue, in the temple with the rabbis. So we all have childhood markings. And some of your markings are really positive. You have wonderful memories. You have wonderful recollections of what you did and who you were with and how you were raised, and moms and dads. Some of you don't have as positive, or it's a mixture. Some of you have memories that need some healing. Childhood markings were literally marks. Some people have literal marks on their back or their psyche or their emotions because of the way they were raised. They have childhood markings. So our markings are a mixture. Isn't it funny how when you're about 20 or 21 and you start getting into adulthood, you say to yourself or you say out loud, you know, I was raised a particular way. We've all said it in some fashion or form about this, but I'm not going to be married like my parents were married, and I'm not going to raise my kids like I was raised. And we've all said that in one way or another. Then we have our kids and we go, oh my God, I'm looking just like my dad or just like my mother, right? I mean, it's like, oh gosh, I said I wasn't going to be like this. And all of that's because of the way we were shaped, right? Part of that is being at home, homecoming. Part of it is knowing who we are, our identity. Growing, or not, in identity and purpose is all about that. Think about how much of your identity is shaped by those first, say, 20 years of your life. You know, psychologists tell us that most of our character and personality development is done by 5. It's done by 5. That's scary, isn't it? So this is a little economic and social justice question that I ask all of us, including St. Michael and all angels, is that we pay the people who get the lowest pay in our culture are the people who teach our children between 0 and 5. Now, do you think that's correct? If most of their character and personality development is done by the time they're 5, shouldn't we pay those people a lot of money? I think something is really wrong in that part of our economic culture. I think that, by the way, our teachers are the highest paid in Dallas County here now because of the thing I'm talking about right now. They're not high paid. You're not going to get rich working at our preschool, but I'm telling you, we've made some we've made some development on that. And then original blessing and belonging has to do with history, forebears, family, and community DNA. You remember the home in which you were raised? Think about it for a minute. Close your eyes and think about that house. Where was it? The neighborhood? Who was in the house? Where was your bedroom? Who was in the neighborhood? What were some of the families around your neighborhood? If you were on a ranch or a farm, who was way, way down the highway? I remember going down to the Miller's house on Sunday night because in 1961 or 2 or 3, I forget what year it was, we left in 62, so it had to be before that. They were the only ones in the entire town in which I grew up who had a color television. And there was only the Wonderful World of Disney on Sunday night. Everybody on the neighborhood would go down to the Miller's house and we'd have milkshakes and French fries and hamburgers every Sunday night to watch the Wonderful World of Disney. Isn't that funny? No one would think about doing something like that now. I mean, the whole neighborhood went down to the Miller's house. We had an old Magnavox. I was 7. I tell my children, some of you just laugh at this because you had a radio. I mean, you had a radio. That's all you had. But we had an old Magnavox black and white we got it when I was 7. And remember the rabbit ears and aluminum foil? And you had to go over. We tell our children you had to go over and change the channel. And we had 2 channels. We did not get NBC. We got CBS and ABC. We couldn't get NBC in our town. And so and it would have all the snow on it. And your father would say, "Go over and grab that aluminum, boy." And you go over there and grab it. And while you grab it, the picture was clear. But you had to keep holding it. You had to stand over there and hold the rabbit ear so that you could see Walter Cronkite. Anyway, funny. Our history is so important. In fact, when we have deaths at St. Michael, some of you know this, is if the children or the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren are there, it's very common that I'll say to them, you have a job to do, and one of your jobs is to tell stories about your grandmother or your great-grandmother, whoever has died, so that they know that part of their living into their identity, their homecoming, is to know the stories of their household, their forebears, and their family and community DNA. Well, there's a second theme, and that's leaving home. There's some healthy sides to this according to our authors and Scripture. There's a healthy kind, and there's an unhealthy kind. The first one on A, I put healthy maturing, establishing one's own self-differentiation. It's the outgoing tide that Buechner talks about in his book. And all of us have had that. You want to sing your own song, you want to create your own sort of journey. But you know your journey, wherever you go, is still always attached to the original home. You know, we can't go anywhere or establish anything new without also realizing that we're tethered. And we can't cut the aprons. We can cut the apron strings, but we don't cut the legacy and the DNA that we're part of. And there's healthy maturing. We all know that doesn't have to do with self-service or pride. It has to do with healthy self-differentiating. That is, that we all find our own sort of place, our own niche. There's also unhealthy departures. And of course, the story that talks the most about that is the prodigal son. I think out of all the things that Jesus was and did, the greatest thing that he ever did for us was on Holy Weekend, Good Friday and Easter morning. The greatest thing he ever said was the parable of the prodigal son. There's a lot of great things that he said and taught. Out of everything that he taught, we would have to say that a primary, if not the primary story that he ever taught was the parable of the prodigal son. More literature, more themes have come out of that one parable, and that's why Henri Nouwen's written a whole book about it, but it's also based on Rembrandt's painting, his third painting, by the way. He did three paintings of the prodigal son, and the most famous one that this book is built on is in the Hermitage Museum, which is in St. Petersburg, Russia. Anybody seen that? Wow, more than a few have been to the Hermitage. Well, there it is on the front. Some of you, he spent a whole week sitting in the Hermitage Museum with the curator's permission, by the way. He got previous permission to go in and just sit in the room. That's the only place he went. He sat all day long from 8 to 4 o'clock. He had permission from the curator to go in and just sit for 5 days in a row and just look at the painting. And you know, there's people who blow through museums. We blew through some in Italy. The Uffizi, for example, the last day, or the day before the last day, our group of 24 of us, we were just blowing through the Uffizi Museum. And of course, it's so American to do this. We go, yep, there's the Mona Lisa, yep, there's the David, yep, check it off. Yeah, we're on the move. Yeah, hey, did you go to the Uffizi? Yeah, saw everything. Saw everything in an hour and a half. These things that have taken generations to make, Americans just blow through like there's nothing to be studied. Yes, there is. He spent an entire week with just one painting, folks. And that's the way really we ought to study art. Any art history majors in here? You all know what I'm talking about, don't you? Americans not just Americans, by the way, everybody blows through museums. By the way, the Chinese, now that they have a middle class, they're in all the museums around the world. You've heard this? All the museums are packed now with Chinese. And Americans go in and go, who are these people? We're the ones who get to come to the museums. Anyway, so Nouwen talks about the unhealthy kind of departure, which is motivated by pride and self-service. And that's, of course, the prodigal. The youngest son in the story, you know the story, how he leaves home, grabs all the money and runs, goes to a far country, squanders his money and his time and his life on what's called, in Luke, loose living. That's one of those understatements. Any of us who are a college boy, we know that's an understatement. It's called loose living. Really? Loose living. What does that look like? It looks bad is what it is. You don't want to really know any more details. It's like too much information. It's like that movie Hangover. Right, when they go to Las Vegas. And remember at the very end of the movie, they're looking at all the photos from the 24-hour period and they go, oh! Like that. It's one of those nights. Loose living is like, oh my God, I did that? So he's not doing very well, and he finds himself in a pig pen. Of course, that's so funny, that story, because he's a Jewish boy. Where's a Jewish boy not to end up in a pig pen? And so he says to himself, self, you're in a bad place. He's talking out loud to himself like all of us do from time to time. It's like, oh my God, how did I end up here? It must be somebody else's fault. That's what our culture says now. It must be mom's fault. It must be, I don't know, not my fault. We have this chip in our neck these days that says, it's not my fault in our culture. And you want to say, what? Sure, really? Yeah, it is. You're the one who put yourself here, and you're in this pig pen because you were full of pride and full of self-interest, right? So he finds himself there. He did say, self, you need to go home. And when you go home, you're going to get a lot of recrimination, but it's going to be worth it because this is a bad place. And at least that's going to be better because you'll at least be home and you'll be subject to being a servant when you get home because that's what you deserve. That's what he's saying to himself now. So he expects recrimination. And so he has an unhealthy departure. He's motivated by pride and self-interest. I'm going to hold that story for a minute. Craig Barnes then says that when we're in that far country, we have what he calls the alienated nomadic soul in this book, the danger of being homeless. And of course, he doesn't just mean physically homeless. All of us can be in the place where we don't feel like we have any home, any homecoming, any sense of place, any niche, purpose, identity. There's a lot of people roaming around our world who have a lot of money, by the way. Some who have no money, some who have a lot of money. So money's not the determinant here. of what Craig Barnes is talking about, the alienated nomadic self, the danger of being homeless, is a real bad place to be. And he talks about that in this book. Then he goes on to talk about the challenges of the untethered lives. And Dante talks about that in the Inferno. He quotes that in this book. Dante talks about the untethered soul being like being in the Inferno. In fact, that is hell. For Dante, and then for Craig Barnes, and for the whole Christian pilgrimage, hell is the untethered life. You're not connected to anything. You're not connected to God. You're not connected to self, and you're not connected to neighbor. So the three parts of the Great Commandment are not there. They're empty. And we all know this is true in our culture. You know that isolation's getting worse in our culture. I've talked about this before. Social media is at an all-time high, and loneliness and isolation are at an all-time low, or at an all-time high, whichever way you want to do the measurement. But isolation and loneliness are on the rise, even as we have this high level of social media. Isn't that interesting? So that should get our attention. And then Craig Barnes also then talks about finding and creating home wherever we are. And that's different from an untethered life. Home is where your hat is, hanging your hat. Home is where the heart is. Those old sort of statements that we say, that you can be somewhere else that's not your place of upbringing and be home. Certainly Valerie and I, as the reason why this theme was on my mind for this Sunday is because of our impending departure. To let you know that we came 8 years ago. We had never lived in Texas. We had no connection. I learned all my hand signals. This one and this one and this one and this one, all of them. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have started this. It's got two levels. It's a pony, I think, here, and then this is a frog. You have to change your finger position a little bit. And the bear and all those things that identify Texans. But more than that, just this kind of free range. I call it, it's like free range chickens, like free range. It's like this can-do spirit that's Texas, and we've loved it. We really have loved it, and this will always be a place that we call home. And so home is not necessarily where you grow up. Home can be in another place. Finding and creating home wherever we are is, again, part of the Christian journey. And leaving home is also full of remembrances and recollections. Nouwen also wrote a book called A Room Called Remembrance, which is a fascinating, Buechner wrote that, A Room Called Remembrance. Frederick Buechner wrote it. And he talks about remembrances and recollections. Of course, we talk about that in the Christian life all the time, and we do this every Sunday. Do this in remembrance of me, Jesus' words when he had the Last Supper. Do this in remembrance of me. One of my theologians, Charlie Price, who's the main systematic theologian in my entire life, out of all the professors I ever had, he was the most important person in my life for a lot of reasons. I won't go into that. But he wrote his doctoral dissertation, his PhD, on the Old Testament themes of remembrance. Jesus didn't make this up. He lived from a DNA, a community that said remembrance is crucial to who we are as people with God. We have to have a good memory about who we are. And I tried to say that in the sermon, maybe half-baked this morning, but we have to tell the whole story, not just part of it. We're so prone to pick and choose the pieces that fit our agenda about the history. Africa's a lot about that. We just got back from Africa, and there's a book that I saw on the bookshelf in the airport that said, history, in whose interpretation is it being written? That was a title of a book. And of course, Africa is real sensitive about this right now. That is, what is this continent? Well, we've been told for so long by white writers what the continent's about. And now some really good African writers are writing about their history, which is much different from the way white people wrote the history. You know, Florida history was based on St. Augustine and being founded in 1521. You know, they discovered, this is so funny for a Floridian, that the entire city is built on the history that it was founded in 1521, and now they found out that it was not founded in 1521. They had an entire 500-year, must have been earlier, because it was last year, must have been 1514, not 1520, because they had their 500-year history last year, so 1514. And they found out 2 years ago, as they were planning the 500-year anniversary, that it was not founded in 1514, not till 1560s. And the first Europeans that landed in America didn't land at St. Augustine. They landed in present-day Jacksonville, Florida, where Valerie grew up. And it wasn't the Spanish at all. It was the French. So it's just ruined St. Augustine and their whole sense of history. So you have to figure out who's writing my history. They based their whole kitchen sink on a book that was written in the 1850s that told of this history. Well, that history's wrong. How did they find out? They went over to Portugal and Spain and France, and they looked up in the annals of the explorers. You'd figure that they would have done this a long time ago, right? They found out that Ponce de Leon never landed in St. Augustine. Never. He never set foot in St. Augustine. In fact, when he sailed his boat up, which was going to go to St. Augustine, he stopped around Cocoa Beach, but he never came to shore. He turned his boat around, went around Key West, went over near Tampa, but he never set foot there either. He landed somewhere between Mobile and Pensacola, and he landed in the 1560s, okay? Fort Caroline, which is outside of Jacksonville, that's the first place that Europeans landed in America. And guess what, pilgrims, if you're from 1621, that's about 40, 50 years before 1620 or 1607, and then later Jamestown, 1621. So you see how this history can be remade. And also leaving home, I got to hurry. Leaving home, according to these writers in Scripture, is also establishing new rituals and measures of belonging. It's part of the healthy maturing that all three of these writers talk about, but mainly Nouwen and Barnes. You know, one of the things I try to tell couples when they're getting married about creating home as a theme, as two family heritages are coming together. We do a lot of family heritage work and premarital counseling because so much of what is expected in marriage comes out of how we're raised. And you know, the first downside of when the people get married, you all know this because if you've been married or you're presently married, you know this is true, is the first downside is the emotion of disappointment. You're disappointed because you found out that she or he is not exactly what you thought she or he was going to be. So let me just use an example. Let's say your mama was a really good cook. My mother was, and my grandmother was an old Southern cook and whatever, always had stuff going on the stove and in the oven or whatever. So let's say your mama was a really, 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 really good cook. And then, so what you learned, let's say you're a guy and you're getting married to your wife. Let's use that metaphor first. And so you have an automatic built-in DNA from your family upbringing that women and wives, but particularly yours, is going to be a fabulous cook. Even if she says to you while you're engaged and dating, I hate cooking, and I'm not good at cooking, you say, she'll get over it. This thing will change because my wife and the mother of our children is going to be a good cook because that's my heritage, right? And so I have to get people over this. in premarital counseling that, or let's say that your father was a tinkerer and could fix anything and had tools galore and could make and fix and whatever, fix the car and fix the lawnmower and repair the roof, okay? And you're a woman. You saw your dad doing this, if you're in the South, Daddy, doing this every weekend, and then you marry your guy. He doesn't have a tool. He doesn't know a Phillips head from a regular head to save his life. He's a lawyer. And about the month into the marriage, the lawnmower breaks, or you need to have a light bulb fixed or something. And he's on the phone. Yeah, Charlie, yeah, can you come over and fix my light bulb? And she's thinking, what's wrong with this guy? He's supposed to be able to fix stuff. So establishing new rituals and measures of belonging really is very important in terms of homemaking, homecoming. And I encourage couples when they're getting married to establish their own and sometimes new rituals. Or if people move from one city to another, I also encourage them to do that. Psychologically speaking, it creates homecoming. We Episcopalians know this. Most denominations don't know this because they don't have enough ritual. We have a lot of ritual, and that's one reason why I'm an Episcopalian. Because Emil Durkheim, who's the great sociologist, said, ritual builds solidarity. That's the best thing that he ever found out about studying societies, is that ritual builds solidarity. That's why it's hard to convert a Muslim, because they kneel down 5 times a day and pray together with the rest of the world. That's why it's hard to convert a Muslim. Not that we're trying, but I'm just saying if you tried, it would be difficult because they have a ritual that they do 5 times a day, and they do it with zillions of people. 5 times a day. It's tough to convert an Episcopalian, too. I mean, most of you know this, is if you married a Baptist, if she's a Baptist, she's not a Baptist anymore. She's an Episcopalian. Because the Episcopalians are the one who says, I'm sorry, I can't go to that church. Because when I go to that church, guess what they say? I don't feel like I've been to church. That's what people say. What is all that about? It's about ritual. It's all about ritual. You all don't have enough candles. You don't have processions. You don't have banners. You don't have robes. You don't have color. I mean, we gotta have a lot of stuff. That's not about having stuff, by the way. It's about ritual. And rituals are good. And Valerie and I established one that really is a homecoming kind of thing. Probably not any longer, but our girls probably will have this. We decided that Halloween and All Saints Day would be one of the ones when we would have a new ritual. And so we created new rituals when we got married that were not her rituals growing up, were not my rituals growing up, but we created a new rituals. And that's about homecoming, about homemaking. I gotta move. Longing for home. When we're away from where we would call home, when we've left home to go somewhere else, either spiritually, psychologically, physically, or otherwise, then we have a longing for home. That's what this book is about, the longing for home. And we have a longing for home. What's that about? Well, Buechner talks about, he has a wonderful spin in this book about how longing is attached to belonging. To have a longing for home is to have a longing to belong. And that's the number one ingredient, by the way, in church building these days. Not the building of a church building. I mean building a church community. The most important feature of building a church community in this culture right now has to do with belonging. Young adults craving belonging. And it's all about what I mentioned earlier. Social media has created dislocation. And people are looking for belonging. We're longing for home. We have a desire to return. We've all had that feeling, that pull. We all have it on vacation or holiday when you're somewhere for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. You have a kind of an internal clock. Has this happened to you before? An internal clock that says, I got to get home. It's not just about the smelly clothes in the bag. And it's not just about maybe a lumpy bed or the pillow that you missed back at home. It is about those things. There are some physical qualities that Valerie and I enjoyed getting back and having our shower, right? Or our pillow or whatever. But it's not just that. You know, it's much deeper than that. This internal clock is, I got to get home. But there's more to it than just being on holiday or vacation. We have this longing for home in a lot of ways that has to do with spiritually. And it's with God and it's with others. And Craig Barnes talks about that in this book because he talks about going down to come up. This journey back home is coming down to go up. And the prodigal son certainly represents that. Is he expected recrimination, going down before you can come up, expected recrimination. So what did he get? He didn't get recrimination, did he? He got a loving parent who ran out to greet him. Couldn't wait. You can imagine being on the front porch of the old home place, we might say. Let's say at the ranch, you see your boy coming up the road, and you're sitting expectantly on the front porch. You see him, you see his profile. You know it's him because of the shape of his head or whatever, and you run as the parent out to greet him. And remember what happens. He embraces him. He puts the family ring on his finger, puts the family cloak around his shoulder. He reinstates him, you see, into the family of heritage and belonging. And then he said, let's have a party. Right? Wow. Now I say that's radical hospitality. The one who doesn't deserve to come home because of his misbehaving is welcomed lavishly. So if you put that into present context, who gets to have a home? That's a question that I'm asking you. Who gets to have a home? Everybody. That's the answer. Everybody deserves to have a home. I don't care about their behavior, how many times they've been to prison, anything, any measurement you want to name. Radical welcome and hospitality in the Gospels is based on this parable. Now that's disturbing for some people because they think in the sociogram and the geopolitical nature, no, I'm sorry, we can't welcome you because you've been in prison 3 times now and 3 times you're out. Or whatever. You can name whatever category you want to name. As disgusting as the category might be, you have to say in God's providence, what would happen if that person wanted to return home? Prodigal son story. God's waiting on the front porch to welcome home any child who has gone adrift and has left home for any reason, unhealthy or healthy. Well, that's a hard one for Christians. But Craig Barnes also wants to recognize that the road home is not an easy one. It's arduous. He calls it the arduous road home. He has a whole chapter in here based on Dante's Inferno. And it is an arduous road home. It's not arduous on God's side of the equation. It's arduous on our side of the equation. You know, in the story of the prodigal son, he's rehearsing. All the way home, he's rehearsing what he's going to say to his daddy. I'm going to say, Father, I've been a rogue. I've been a misbehaving, whatever. And I've treated the name wrong, and I treated you wrong. And he's rehearsing all this. It's arduous to go through all that. You know, the 12-step program of AA teaches us this, doesn't it? Not just for alcoholics, but any of us. And that is one of the steps. Someone has to tell me the step. When you have to go back to everyone you've ever done wrong to, does anybody know which step that is? 8. 8. Thank you, Ed. Number 8 in the 12 steps is you're asked by AA 12-step spirituality, we would say. You have to go back and you have to say, I'm sorry to anyone that you've ever damaged. Wow. You know where they got that? You know that Bill, who started the 12 steps of AA, he learned that by being in a Bible study in an Episcopal church in New York City on the Epistle to the Romans. They did a Bible study on the Romans. They came up with 5 steps of restoration, when we've been in trouble, when we haven't been home. And they put 5 steps together of the whole process of restoration. Out of those 5 steps, then Bill and others created the 12 steps of AA. They didn't build the steps based on alcoholics, you see. They built it on all of us, no matter what our condition is. All of us have a condition, by the way. Alcoholism is only one among many of the conditions that we can have. And so the 8th step, thank you, Ed, is what's it called? Making amends?
Make the correct amends, may we affirm, except when to do so would injure them or others.
There you go. It's right out of the Gospels. Okay, homecoming, reunion, and God welcomes us back. I've already talked about that. And it's like Buechner talks about the incoming tide. It's like, wow. You know, Valerie will joke, we joke with each other. She'll say, because I had an elocution professor at Florida State who said to me, we're going to drum that Southern out of you. And we're going to drum that Southern out of you. So what she did was, you know, all of us who used to say, have 4 syllables to God, she would teach us to say God. Okay? Southerners don't just, it's not just 1 syllable. Texans too, by the way. But when we go home, Valerie will say, you know, you take on a little bit of the lingo again. We say cut on the lights and such like that. Mash the button when we get into an elevator. Except South Carolina, you say mash the button. Say mash. What's that word? Mash the button. And people get on an elevator, they hear a South Carolinian say, mash the button. They go, what? And, of course, people from Great Britain, if you said cut on the lights, it's like, what? We're going to cut on the lights? Of course, they say, mind your head. And I think that's probably better than watch your head. You can't see the top of your head. So English are actually right. You mind the top of your head. You can't, we say, watch your head. You go, what? I can't see the top of my head. The response of the elder sons of the world is also part of homecoming, according to Henri Nouwen. You know, these are the people who've always kept the rules, who stayed home, who didn't leave, who minded the parents, who didn't ever have any sense of their own self, and there's problems. There's unhealthy problems to this. You know, the oldest son is as unhealthy in the story as the younger boy, right? His issues are different. One's not worse than the other, but they both have issues to deal with. That's true in any family, by the way. Every child, every parent, everyone has dysfunction. Just to what degree and what is it? And the oldest son is part of the family dysfunction. And, of course, Henri Nouwen really shapes this up in his book about it's part of homecoming. When you come home, there's always some relatives who want to tell stories that are not quite the way you remember them. I have cousins who live on the family farm highway, what's called Perkins Farm. We knew old man Perkins, the guy it's named after. When I was a kid, I knew Mr. Perkins. His name Perkins Highway. Well, you can imagine what this looks like. It's any Texas road that's dirt that goes to a lot of ranches. You know, it's in every state, but it's really in Texas. It's that kind of road. And I have 3 cousins who live on it. Their names are Ricky, Louie, and Joey. And Valerie calls them Huey, Dewey, and Louie. And they really are. They're just Bubba all the way. I mean, Ricky has on his truck, I don't know how he got this sticker. He has a big old redneck truck. And he has on a sticker, they will not take my guns away from me until they pry my cold, dead fingers from around it. He has that on a sticker. I'm thinking, God, that's a lot of language on a sticker. Just put on there, don't take my guns, or something like that. My other cousin, who is Louie, who Valerie's never met Louie. That's a good thing that she hadn't met Louie. He has a sign both in English and in Spanish. If you set your foot on my property, I'll shoot you. So we have to call him up. I'm coming on your property, don't shoot me. So there's some older sons, right, who are waiting at home, who are not, they're a little off. And part of homecoming is the challenge of this extended family that, we don't always want to talk about. You got to tell the whole story. Remember I said that in the sermon. The whole story. You can't hide the cousins in the closet. We've done that with, seriously now, not so much funny. We've done that a lot with gay and lesbian members of our family, and to a great discredit, great, huge human hurt discredit. Is there are people who are of infinite value and talent and place in the family who've been hidden away, and we don't want to talk about it. And we used to do it whispers, like, families would say, yeah, cousin, whatever, he's a little different, we would say, or we used to use the word for other folks who had learning challenges. We'd say they're slow, right? Cousin Billy is slow. And Cousin Billy may have had dyslexia. So we've learned a lot, haven't we? We've learned a lot about telling the whole story of the whole family, including the people who are just a little bit different from the rest of us. I have a niece who's lesbian. She's one of the great people of this world, and Valerie and I love her very much. And she is really a great human being. And we think she was made that way, and we think that she's of great value. And she might have a partner sometime, and that's just fine with us. I'll just tell you, I think that's fine with us. And I think that's I don't think it's any of our choice to say you can't have someone who's close to you in terms of a relationship. I think it's straight people like us who think they shouldn't have that. And I think she's of great value to our family, and I hope that at some point she's able to tell that story in a more verbal and public way in our family. We haven't arrived. We have a ways to go on this. But Valerie and I are very encouraging to her about this. So, celebration and the communion table. Luke 24, the road to Emmaus is one of the great stories about homecoming, about reunion, is after Jesus is raised from the dead. The two pilgrims who are walking to Emmaus then recognize Jesus in the breaking of the bread. And we talk a lot about this in the Episcopal Church, about homecoming at the communion table, how everybody has a place at the communion table. And that's true. And that's why, by the way, I don't say it the day the bishop's here, because our canons specifically say the person has to be baptized. In reality, though, if someone comes to the rail and they're seeking in some way and they haven't been baptized for whatever reasons, and we don't ask them, we don't give them a questionnaire. Tell me why you haven't been baptized. If they come to the rail and they're seeking, they hold their hands out. Guess what? I'm putting bread in their hands. I'm putting bread in their hands because they're seeking in some way. So that's why every Sunday morning I say all are welcome. This is an open communion. I know that's disturbing to some people who are more traditionalists and think it's just for those who've been baptized in the Trinity. I think it is for the Trinity baptism. I think it is a communion, a family meal. But if you have a stranger over for the family meal, do you make them sit in the kitchen? Hey, welcome, Billy. We're glad you're here. We know you're from Kansas and you're coming here to have dinner with us. But you're a stranger. You're not one of us. You're not from our parts. And we have a good plate of food for you. It's in the kitchen. We're going to eat here in the dining room. Really? No, you're going to set up a place right at your dining table. Welcome him to the family meal, right? Whether he's from your family or not. So I'd like us to get over this in the Episcopal Church. Traditionalists think it's just for the baptized. Those of us who are a little bit more open say, I'm not quite sure about that. I think the radical generosity of the prodigal son tells us, and the road to Emmaus, by the way, the Luke text really says, someone shows up at the table and they've got their hand out, their heart's open, we're ready for them to be part of the family meal. Now, it's up to them if they're a Muslim and they feel like we don't want to upset their tradition either. And so we don't say, well, there's something wrong with you if you stay in the pew, or there's something wrong with you if you put your arms like this over your chest. No, we don't have that evaluation. We're just glad they're there. And that goes to G, creating homecoming for others. Remember John 21, Peter is reinstated. He denied 3 times. He's reinstated 3 times. Do you love me? You know, Lord, I love you. Do you love me, Peter? You know I love you. Are you really sure you love me? Yes, Lord. You know everything about me, and you know that I love you. Right? 3 affirmations to reestablish Peter into the household. And then what's he told? Go and feed my sheep. In other words, go out on mission and create homecoming for others. John 21. It's all about creating homecoming for others who don't have a home in God and with neighbor. And then last, a hopeful final home. All 3 of the books talk about this. A realized eschatology. Eschatology about the end time, but realizes we can realize some of it now. In the Lord's Prayer we say, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Right? What we're to do on earth now in this life is to be like we understand will be in heaven. If there's no racism in heaven, then there's not to be any on earth. If there's not any homophobia in heaven, there's not to be any on earth. If there's not any poverty in heaven, there's not to be any on earth, right? Just make the juxtaposition and say whatever we think heaven is going to be like. And of course the book of Revelation says there's no more gnashing or crying, there's no more pain or grieving, that we're all one family around one Lord and one altar in heaven. That's the vision that's given to us. If that's the vision, then what are you and I doing about creating that on earth? That's realized eschatology. The end time is being realized now. So the hopeful final home is not just a future promise, it's also something that can be realized now. And it's ever present and it's final dwelling with God. And that leads us to the last thing, and that's the communion of saints and all the company of heaven. I love that line in our prayer book. When we celebrate the Eucharist, we say, and all the saints and the communion of heaven, the company of heaven. So we have a long legacy that we get to join. I don't know how that's going to work, but I got a lot of questions I want to ask when I get there from a lot of people. And who knows who gets to sit at the table with us. We're going to be surprised, I think that. There's going to be some people who are hanging around the table in the heavenly banquet. And we go, oh God, I didn't think you'd get here. We have some people from our upbringing who we think that about. Billy Brady, who used to beat me up in first grade. Every day he gave me a beating in first grade going home. He picked me out for his sport. And one day I beat him up. It was the sweetest blood I've ever seen in my life. But I think Billy Brady's going to be sitting there with me and it's like, God, I didn't think you'd get here. You beat me up every day in first grade. But we're going to be surprised. And I think all that's about homecoming. My time is up. I'm glad to be with you this morning. Lisa's going to be with you next week. I don't have the title of the book, and you don't either? Okay, Lisa's going to be here next week. Okay, great. Wonderful. Go forth. Good to have you. Have a good week.